Every one of these men walked into federal prison already dangerous, but only one made the institution reorganize itself around his presence. 10 bikers, 10 sentences. One man at the end of this list that corrections officers still talk about today. Stay until the end. Number 10. Thomas Heath, the bomber who never stopped. Thomas Heath spent 4 decades proving that some men simply do not become less dangerous with age. He was a long-standing member of the Hells Angels Ventura chapter in California, and by the time a judge sentenced him to 35 years to life in 2011, he was 64 years old. The sentence was understood by everyone in the courtroom as a death sentence. A man sentenced at 64 to a minimum of 35 years before parole eligibility will be 99 before any board reviews his case. In 1977, Heath was involved in a bombing at a Los Angeles auto shop targeted in the Hells Angels war with the Mongols. A 15-year-old boy and a 22-year-old man died. Neither had any involvement in the conflict, they were simply there. Heath was not convicted of the killings until 1994, 17 years later, when prosecutors finally assembled enough evidence. He received 7 years and was released. In 1992, while still active in the club, he was convicted of assaulting his wife with a deadly weapon. Another 7 years. In 2010, a woman asked him to leave her home. His response was to refuse, threaten to kill her and her son, and add the specific warning that if he couldn't finish the job himself, the Hells Angels would. When police arrived, he said it directly to them too. The prior strikes did the rest. Prosecutors described his file as a horrible criminal history. That was not an exaggeration. Inside custody, Heath is feared not for what he can still physically do, but for what his documented record proves he has already done. The bomb, in 1977, the assault, 4 decades of continuous criminal behavior without a single moment of visible recalibration. Reputation, inside the federal prison system, does not expire. It follows a man from facility to facility, and Heath's record is one of the most complete in the system. He opens this countdown because he represents the baseline, a man who entered prison and never stopped being exactly who he was outside of it. The specific irony of Heath's final sentence is worth sitting with. The crime that produced 35 years to life, refusing to leave a woman's home and threatening to kill her and her son, was taken in isolation, a relatively minor offense. Without the prior strikes under California's 3 strikes law, a court would have had significant discretion to impose something proportional. With the 1,977 murder conviction and the 1,992 assault conviction already on his record, the sentence became automatic. The law removed the judge's discretion precisely to address men like Heath, men whose history of violence demonstrated that proportionality was not an appropriate framework for sentencing them. Heath had been at the center of the Hells Angels war with the Mongols during one of its most violent periods. That war, which formally began in 1977 when the Hells Angels declared war over the Mongols' use of a California bottom rocker, involved bombings, ambushes, and organized attacks across Southern California. The 1977 auto shop bombing was not a spontaneous act of anger. It was part of an organized campaign. The shop was targeted because of its connection to the Mongols. That the victims, a 15-year-old and a 22-year-old, had no gang connections was not a consideration that appeared to constrain anyone involved. What 17 years of freedom between the bombing and the conviction tells you is how the code of silence actually functioned during that period. Not one person who knew what had happened and people knew said anything to law enforcement for nearly 2 decades. The case broke only when enough forensic and documentary evidence had accumulated to build a prosecution without relying on witness testimony from inside the club's world. That is what the Hells Angels culture of silence produced, a man walking free for 17 years after participating in the deaths of 2 innocent bystanders. Inside the corrections system, the institutional response to Heath has been the same across his multiple periods of incarceration. Careful, cautious management of a man whose documented history makes predictions about his future behavior straightforward. A man who has committed violence across 4 decades, against multiple categories of victims without any visible modification of his behavior in response to legal consequences, is a man whose risk profile does not diminish with age. The guards and officers who have managed Heath know his file. His file is the most accurate guide to who he is. He opens this countdown at number 10, not because he is the least significant of the 10 men on this list. He is here because he represents the baseline, a man who entered the prison system repeatedly, served his sentences, and came out unchanged each time. What comes above him on this list is men who did more, went further, and in some cases changed the institution around them, rather than simply enduring it. Let me say one thing, and then I won't bring it up again. I have gathered everything you could possibly imagine about bikers and hidden secrets into this book. Available at my website, theinvestigator.com. If you want it, it is there. That is all. Number 9. George Wethern, the man with a death warrant on his head. George Wethern is not on this list because of what he did inside prison. He is on this list because of what prison did to him and what the club he betrayed vowed to do to him forever. Wethern was the vice president of the Hells Angels Oakland chapter, the most powerful chapter of the most powerful motorcycle club in America. He stood at Sonny Barger's right hand during the years the organization was building the criminal infrastructure that would define it for generations. In 1973, with 3 bodies found buried on his Northern California ranch and federal investigators closing in, he made the decision that no senior Hells Angels leader had ever made before. He cooperated. His ranch, 156 acres, officially a cattle operation, turned out to be a disposal site. The remains of 3 people were found in abandoned wells on the property. 1 was a woman. 2 were Hells Angels, who had allegedly plotted against club leadership. The case linked Wethern to multiple murders, drug trafficking, and years of organized criminal activity. Facing the rest of his life in prison, he provided federal prosecutors with a comprehensive insider account of how the Oakland chapter operated the drug routes, the violence, the command structure, the names. More than a dozen indictments followed. He and his family entered the Federal Witness Security Program. In 1978, he published Wayward Angel, a memoir that gave the public the clearest insider account of the Hells Angels anyone had ever provided. The club's response was absolute. A standing death warrant was issued. Any member who encountered Wethern was to kill him on sight. That contract, according to former members who have discussed it, was never revoked. His specific position inside the prison system during the brief period before his cooperation deal was completed was one of the most dangerous any biker has occupied. He was not feared as a threat. He was feared as a target. Every patch-wearing member who shared a facility or a transport with him knew what he had done and what the club's standing instructions were. He was the first. Every subsequent biker informant was measured against him. He makes this list at number 9 because his case defined a category of prison fear that no one before him had created. The man who knew everything, gave it all away, and spent the rest of his life hunted by the organization he had belonged to. Understanding why Wethern sits at number 9 requires understanding what it meant to be the first. The Hells Angels had been operating for 25 years by 1973. In that time, the code of silence had been tested, had bent under pressure in individual cases, but had never broken at the senior leadership level. No chapter president, no national officer, no one with genuine organizational knowledge had ever provided a comprehensive account of how the club operated to federal authorities. Wethern was the vice president of the Oakland chapter, not a peripheral figure, not someone who had attended a few meetings and overheard things. He was Barger's number 2. He had access to the full picture of how the organization operated, the finances, the drug routes, the violence, the decision-making process that connected Barger's instructions to what happened on the street. When he agreed to cooperate, he was handing federal investigators something they had never had, a genuine insider account from someone who had been present at the decisions that mattered. The death warrant the club issued in response was not simply a punishment. It was an institutional signal, a communication to every other member about what the consequences of cooperation would be, directed not just at Wethern, but at anyone who might consider the same choice. The message was simple. There is no deal good enough to protect you. The government can give you a new name and a new location. We will find you. We will wait. The contract does not expire. That message worked. For years after Wethern's cooperation, the rate of senior Hells Angels leadership voluntarily cooperating with federal investigators remained extremely low. The shadow of what had happened to Wethern, the complete social death of expulsion, and the physical threat of a standing death warrant created a powerful disincentive that operated independently of any specific threat. Men facing federal charges did the math and concluded that the club's permanent hostility was more dangerous than the federal sentence they faced. His memoir, Wayward Angel, published in 1978, added a public dimension to what he had done that made the club's institutional anger even more visible. He had not simply told investigators what he knew, he had put it in a book. He had made the club's internal world available to anyone who bought a copy. The book remained in print for decades. The contract on Wethern's life remained open for the same period. He sits at number 9 because he introduced a category of prison experience that no one before him had occupied. The man inside the walls who is feared not as a threat, but as a target, surrounded by people who know exactly what the standing instructions are regarding him. Number 8. Raymond Folks, the Sonoma president who ran violence like a business. Raymond Folks' nickname was not about intelligence, it was about what he was capable of delivering. As president of the Hells Angels, Sonoma County, Chapter 1 of the most powerful in California, Folks rained violence down on anyone who crossed him or crossed the club, and he did it with the specific methodical discipline of someone who had thought carefully about how to make it most effective. His criminal history before the federal racketeering case was already significant. In 2011, he pleaded guilty to a multi-million-dollar mortgage fraud scheme, forging income statements, submitting fake bank records, obtaining fraudulent loans across Northern California, using at least one property as a secret marijuana grow operation, nearly 6 years, plus more than $1 million in restitution. He came out and did not slow down. In 2014, he was informed that a former member had been having an affair with his common-law wife. He had the man lured to a warehouse. What followed, according to federal court documents, lasted hours, sustained beatings, threats. Deliberate, organized violence that left the victim with facial fractures and permanent damage to his eyesight. Then, Folks turned his attention to the woman, assaulting her and threatening her life to ensure her silence. This was not rage, it was process. A federal jury convicted him in 2023 of racketeering conspiracy, murder conspiracy, assault with a deadly weapon, in aid of racketeering, and witness tampering. He faces up to 60 years. What makes Folks particularly notable inside the prison system is the combination, physical authority and financial intelligence, sustained organized violence and complex financial fraud. The warehouse and the mortgage documents are not two different men. They are the same man operating in different contexts with the same underlying capacity, focused, sustained effort toward a specific outcome, regardless of whether that outcome is financial gain or absolute physical dominance. Federal prosecutors said the Sonoma County chapter was the criminal enterprise. Folks was the enterprise's CEO. The jury agreed. The warehouse incident that defined Folks' federal case deserves specific attention because of its quality. What federal court documents describe is not a brief confrontation or a spontaneous act of anger. It was a sustained, methodical process that lasted hours, designed to produce absolute certainty that the man inside the warehouse understood what the consequences of crossing Raymond Folks were, and absolute certainty that the woman connected to the situation understood that speaking about any of it would produce equivalent consequences for her. That kind of sustained, organized violence requires something that spontaneous violence does not: control. A man who maintains composure across hours of deliberate infliction of pain, who manages multiple participants, who remains focused on the intended outcome across an extended period, is demonstrating a capacity for organizational discipline that is in many ways more disturbing than explosive rage. Rage is comprehensible, it spikes and fades. What Folks demonstrated in the warehouse was colder than rage, it was process. The federal investigators who built the RICO case against the Sonoma County chapter understood that the warehouse and the mortgage fraud were not two separate aspects of Folks' criminal history. They were expressions of the same underlying capacity, applied to different problems. The mortgage fraud required attention to detail, management of complex financial documentation, and the ability to maintain a legitimate appearing business operation while routing criminal proceeds through it. The warehouse required managing participants, maintaining control over an extended confrontation, and ensuring that the intended message was delivered without creating evidence that would immediately produce criminal exposure. Both required the same person, someone with organizational intelligence, patience, and the specific ability to compartmentalize what he was doing from how he presented it to the outside world. That is who federal prosecutors argued Raymond Folks was. That is who the Sonoma County chapter of the Hells Angels had as its president. And that is who walked into federal custody after the 2023 conviction to begin serving a sentence that could reach 60 years. Inside the federal system, Folks' reputation preceded him in a specific and documented way. The men who shared facilities with him, other organized crime figures, gang leaders, men who were not easily intimidated, adjusted their behavior around him based on what they knew his record contained. Not because he was making threats, because the warehouse told them everything they needed to know about what he was willing to do and how methodically he was willing to do it. That kind of reputation does not require active maintenance. It simply exists, preceding a man from facility to facility, shaping how every encounter with him is approached. Number 7. Christopher Ray Ranieri, the cold calculation of the Salem chapter. If Raymond Folks ran violence like a business, Christopher Ranieri ran it like a chess match. The president of the Hells Angels Salem chapter in Massachusetts, Ranieri was described in court records and witness testimony with one consistent word: calculating. Not impulsive, not hot-headed, cold. Deliberate, a man who assessed problems and applied solutions with the same detached efficiency a manager brings to an underperforming department. In July 2014, a Hells Angels member named Joel Silver got into a public argument with a member connected to Ranieri's chapter at a motorcycle event in New Hampshire. Silver had also been badmouthing Jonathan Nelson, president of the Sonoma County, California chapter. This was not simply personal. In the Hells Angels, disrespecting a chapter president is organizational insubordination, and Ranieri handled organizational insubordination decisively. He called his California counterparts. The chapter presidents agreed. Silver had to die. On the 15th of July 2014, Silver was lured to the Fresno clubhouse under the pretense of a meeting. Fresno chapter president Brian Wendt shot him in the back of the head. Merle Hefferman, a man known locally for organizing charity bicycle drives for underprivileged children, arranged for Silver's remains to be secretly cremated at a funeral home. For 8 years, Silver's family had no body, no certainty, no answer to the most basic question about what had happened to their loved one. After the murder, Ranieri flew from Massachusetts to Fresno for a party celebrating what had been done. He was convicted in 2023 of racketeering, conspiracy, and masterminding the murder plot. Life in prison. FBI Special Agent in Charge Robert Tripp stated plainly at the time of conviction, the Hells Angels murdered one of their own. Inside federal custody, Ranieri maintains the same demeanor, quiet, controlled. Other inmates describe him as someone who doesn't need to make threats. His reputation is the threat. The fact that he flew across the country to celebrate a murder he helped organize tells everyone who hears that story everything they need to know about what kind of man they are sharing a prison with. The 8 years between Joel Silver's murder in July 2014 and the convictions in 2022 and 2023 are themselves a statement about the power of the code of silence. For 8 years, nobody talked. Silver's family had no body, no certainty. They were left in the specific, unresolvable grief of the missing, not knowing whether their loved one was alive somewhere or dead, not knowing whether they should mourn or keep hoping. The investigation that finally cracked the case required years of surveillance, wiretapping, and eventually the decision of at least one witness to cooperate with federal investigators. That decision to provide testimony against the chapter presidents who had ordered and carried out a murder was not made casually. It was made by someone who knew exactly what Joel Silver's fate demonstrated about what happened to people who caused problems. That witness spoke anyway. The courage that required is measurable by what had happened to the man whose murder was being prosecuted. What made Ranieri's behavior after the murder so significant to the prosecution was not just what it proved about his involvement, it was what it communicated about who he was. A man who flies across the country to attend a party celebrating a murder he helped organize is not a man who is troubled by what has been done. He is a man who is satisfied with how a problem was resolved and who wants to be present for the institutional acknowledgement of that resolution. The celebration was organizational, not personal. It was the chapter's way of recognizing that someone had handled a situation correctly. Ranieri's presence at that celebration confirmed his role in having defined what correctly meant. The prosecution's case rested significantly on the simple logic that men don't travel thousands of miles to celebrate management problems they had nothing to do with. The jury accepted that logic. The witnesses who testified had taken genuine personal risk to speak. Their testimony, combined with years of surveillance records and the documented facts of what had happened to Silver, produced convictions that carried mandatory life sentences for the men who had shot him and a life sentence for Ranieri, who had made the call. Inside federal custody, Ranieri's reputation operates the same way it operated on the outside, quietly, without visible effort. Other inmates give him space, not because he is making demands, but because his record communicates everything that needs to be communicated. He is a man who helped engineer the murder of a fellow club member and then flew across the country to celebrate it. That information travels faster than any institutional paperwork, and it shapes every interaction in an environment where people are paying close attention to exactly that kind of information. Number 6. Jeffrey Pike, the Bandidos president who ran an empire and died in a cell. Jeffrey Fay Pike built one of the largest criminal enterprises in outlaw motorcycle club history. As national president of the Bandidos, the second largest outlaw club in the world, with more than 5,000 members across multiple countries, he presided over an organization that the federal government spent years documenting and eventually dismantled at the leadership level with a set of convictions that included murder. The specific case that brought him down began in 2006 when a man named Anthony Benesh tried to start a Texas chapter of the Hells Angels in Austin. The Bandidos considered Texas their territory. They warned Benesh to stop. He ignored them. On the 18th of March, 2006, Bandidos members shot Benesh dead outside an Austin restaurant while he was eating dinner with his family. His wife and children were present. What followed was years of federal investigation, wiretaps, financial analysis, and the testimony of cooperating witnesses. After a nearly 3-month trial in 2018, a federal jury convicted Pike of racketeering, conspiracy, murder in aid of racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, assault, extortion, and weapons violations. His national vice president, John Xavier Portillo, was convicted on additional charges, including drug trafficking. In September 2018, a federal judge sentenced Pike to life in prison plus 10 years. He was 63 years old. His wife told reporters the feds had gotten it wrong, that her husband was a family man paying for the sins of bad apples. The jury had heard 3 months of testimony about what Pike authorized, directed, and what his leadership had systematically produced. The Waco, Texas shootout in May 2015, in which 9 people died in a confrontation between the Bandidos, a rival club, and law enforcement at a Twin Peaks restaurant, had occurred while Pike was already under federal investigation and accelerated the timeline that ended with his conviction. Pike sits in federal custody today with no realistic prospect of release. He ran an empire with thousands of members. He managed international operations across multiple countries. He directed murders from the top of an organizational chart, and he is now serving his sentence in the same federal system his club spent decades trying to evade. The Waco, Texas shootout in May 2015, in which 9 people died in a confrontation involving the Bandidos, a rival club called the Cossacks, and law enforcement at a Twin Peaks restaurant, happened while federal investigators were already building their RICO case against the Bandidos' national leadership. The shootout, which was captured on surveillance video and became one of the most widely covered organized crime events of the decade, accelerated the federal investigation by making the Bandidos' capacity for organized violence impossible for anyone to credibly dispute. Pike was not at the Twin Peaks that day, but investigators believed that the club's leadership decisions, including decisions about which rival clubs to treat as enemies and how aggressively to enforce that designation, had created the conditions that produced the confrontation. The Cossacks, the club involved in the Waco violence, had been treated as a problem by Bandido's leadership for some time before the shooting. When problems reached the scale they reached on that afternoon in Waco, with 9 people dead in a parking lot on a weekday, the federal timeline of the investigation against Pike and his vice president moved faster. The trial that followed in 2018, 3 months, with cooperating witnesses, intercepted communications, and financial records, painted a portrait of a man who had managed a national criminal organization with genuine strategic sophistication. Pike knew what was happening in chapters he had never personally visited. He had information systems, reporting structures, and the ability to make organizational decisions at the national level that affected local chapters throughout Texas and beyond. The Anthony Benesch killing the 2006 murder that was the centerpiece of the federal case was not an act of local chapter violence. It was an execution authorized at the national president level in response to a territorial challenge to the Bandido's claim on Texas. His wife's statement after sentencing that he was a family man paying for the sins of bad apples reflected something genuine about the community that knew him. People in certain parts of Texas who had encountered Pike as a neighbor or a community member genuinely could not reconcile that person with the person the federal case described. That gap between the face, a criminal organization, presents publicly, and the operations it conducts privately, was exactly what Pike had managed most effectively for more than a decade as national president. His conviction made that gap permanently, publicly impossible to maintain. The jury saw through both faces and convicted on the basis of what the evidence showed the man behind them had done. Number 5. Adam Lee Hall, the man the FBI called Uncontrollable. In the summer of 2011, a man named David Glasser was scheduled to testify against a Hells Angels sergeant-at-arms named Adam Lee Hall in an assault case in Western Massachusetts. Hall was facing serious charges. Glasser was his problem. Hall's solution to that problem produced one of the most disturbing cases in the history of the Hells Angels in the United States. In August 2011, Hall, sergeant-at-arms of the Berkshire County chapter, orchestrated the kidnapping and murder of not just Glasser, but of 2 other men who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Glasser's roommate, Edward Frampton, a man known locally for participating in the Special Olympics, and Robert Chadwell, a drug counselor who was visiting. Neither had anything to do with the Hells Angels. Their only mistake was being there. All 3 men were shot. Their bodies were dismembered and buried in a shallow grave in Beckett, Massachusetts. The case shocked a region better known for Tanglewood and the Norman Rockwell Museum than for organized crime violence. What made the case particularly revealing about who Hall was, before the murders occurred, Hall had approached the FBI and offered to become an informant to wear a wire and help bring down multiple East Coast Hells Angels chapters. The FBI looked at him and turned the offer down. Their documented reason was that Hall was uncontrollable and much too dangerous. The FBI, which regularly manages cooperation from senior mafia figures, drug cartel members, and high-level organized crime figures, assessed Adam Lee Hall and decided he was too dangerous to handle. That judgment was made before the triple murder. When you understand what he then did, instead of cooperating, killed 3 men, 2 of them completely uninvolved civilians, dismembered their bodies, and buried them in the woods, the FBI's assessment reads less like caution and more like prophecy. He was convicted in February 2014 on 3 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of kidnapping, and multiple counts of witness intimidation. 3 consecutive life terms. No possibility of parole. The judge called the crimes savage, inhumane, and without any trace of mercy. At the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center in Massachusetts, Hall remains a feared figure. Younger Hells Angels members show him deference. Other inmates give him space. He doesn't need to raise his voice. Everyone already knows what he is capable of. The specific details of how the FBI's offer and refusal played out are documented in the Massachusetts State Police Probable Cause Report filed after the triple murder. Hall had approached federal investigators while out on bail on the assault charges, claiming that he could provide information that would allow the Bureau to penetrate and dismantle multiple East Coast Hells Angels chapters. He was offering the kind of cooperation that federal law enforcement regularly seeks and occasionally accepts from organized crime figures facing serious charges. The Bureau reviewed the offer. They consulted with agents familiar with Hall, with his chapter, and with the Hells Angels operations in the Northeast, and they turned him down. Not because the information he might provide wasn't valuable, not because they didn't believe he had genuine access to what he was offering. They turned him down because their assessment of him as an individual, his temperament, his judgment, his capacity for independent and uncontrolled action made the proposition of managing him too dangerous. They concluded that working with Adam Lee Hall created more risk than the intelligence he could provide was worth. That is a rare and specific judgment. The FBI regularly manages informants and cooperating witnesses whose personal histories are deeply criminal. Managing dangerous people is part of the work. When the Bureau's assessment of an individual is that he is too dangerous to manage, it communicates something about that person that goes beyond the ordinary categories of criminality. What Hall then did when the cooperation option was closed and he was facing trial on the assault charges was kill 3 people, not 1, 3, including 2 men who had nothing whatsoever to do with his situation. He killed them because they were there, because they had witnessed things, or because leaving witnesses was a risk he was unwilling to accept. The decision to kill Frampton and Chadwell, alongside Glasser men whose only crime was being present in the wrong apartment on the wrong evening, demonstrates the specific quality of thinking the FBI had identified when it called him uncontrollable. He had no framework for limiting collateral damage because he had no framework for thinking of anyone outside his immediate interests as a person whose life deserved consideration. The 3 consecutive life sentences he received, and the judge's description of the crimes as savage, inhumane, and without any trace of mercy, represent the justice system's response to that specific absence. He sits at number 5 because he represents something more specifically dangerous than organized criminal authority or strategic violence. He represents pure, unfiltered, unpredictable lethality, the kind the FBI assessed and stepped back from. Number 4. George Christie, the most sophisticated biker behind bars. George Christie Jr. does not belong on this list for the same reason as the men above him. His crimes were serious, but not in the same league as Hall, or Pike, or Boucher. He is here because of what he represented inside the prison system, and because of what he took with him when he walked out. Christie served as president of the Hells Angels Ventura chapter for 33 years, 1978 to 2011, the longest-serving chapter president in the club's history. He went to prison 3 times. In 1986, he spent a year in custody on murder-related charges before being found not guilty. In 2001, he was indicted on 59 counts related to prescription drugs, spent a year in solitary confinement in the Ventura County Jail, and took a plea bargain resulting in release. In 2011, after leaving the Hells Angels, he was indicted on conspiracy charges related to the alleged firebombing of rival tattoo parlors and served 10 months. What made Christie different from every other biker who went through the system was how he processed the experience. He watched, he analyzed, he paid attention to who held power and why, what the guards understood and didn't understand, how the prison hierarchy mapped onto the club hierarchy he had managed for decades. He came in as an organizational leader and used the institution the way organizational leaders use every environment they enter, as information. When the warden of the facility holding him in 1986 said, "I know who you are. I know you're the leader of the Hells Angels. Can you run 25 Jews for me?" Referring to the kosher kitchen, Christie said yes and ran it with the same discipline he brought to the Ventura chapter. He was feared in prison not because he was the most physically dangerous man in the room, but because he was the most organizationally capable one. And in institutional settings, organizational capability is its own form of danger. He left the Hells Angels in 2011 and spent the following years writing books, giving interviews, and producing the most honest and detailed public account of how the club actually worked that any senior member has ever provided. His presence in the prison system, the way he absorbed every institution he entered and understood it better on exit than the people running it, is why he sits at number 4. Christie's year in solitary confinement during his 2001 federal case was the prison experience he subsequently described as the most revealing of his career behind bars. Solitary is the institution's most powerful tool for psychological isolation, removing a person from the social context that most people depend on to maintain their sense of self. Without peers, without role, without the social feedback that normal institutional life provides, most people in solitary experience a progressive deterioration of their psychological stability. The studies on long-term solitary confinement document well the damage it does. What Christie did in solitary was think. He read, he wrote, he used the isolation the way a scholar uses a library as an opportunity to examine something he had not previously had the time or the distance to look at clearly. What he was examining was the club, the life, and what 40 years of running the Ventura chapter had actually produced. The conclusions he reached in that year of enforced reflection were visible in everything he did afterward, a progressive willingness to say things about the Hells Angels publicly that no other senior leader was willing to say, and an eventual departure from the club in 2011 that was explained by Christie as the product of a fundamental incompatibility between who he had become and what the organization had become. The specific way Christie functioned inside every prison he entered was itself remarkable. He did not simply endure the institution, he mapped it. He understood who actually held power and why, what the formal hierarchy meant versus what the informal hierarchy was, where the guards' actual concerns lay as opposed to their official mandates. He managed the kosher kitchen at the Ventura County Jail during his 1986 stint with the same organizational approach he brought to his chapter. He was feared inside prison not because of his capacity for violence, though that was documented, but because of his organizational intelligence, which operated whether he was free or locked up. He left the Hells Angels in 2011 and spent the following decade producing the most honest and detailed public account of the organization that any senior member has ever provided. His books, his television appearances, his public interviews, including an extensive podcast conversation in his later years that covered everything from the club's racial politics to the specific mechanics of how chapter presidents managed their territories, gave the public and law enforcement a genuinely useful inside view that decades of surveillance and undercover operations had only partially produced. He sits at number 4 because he represents the category that all the violent men above him can't claim, the man who was smart enough to understand the institution from inside it, and who eventually understood his own club well enough to walk away from it, and who communicated both of those understandings publicly in ways that changed how the outside world perceived what the Hells Angels actually was. Number 3. Harry Taco Bowman, the most wanted biker in America. There was a period in the late 1990s when Harry Taco Bowman was not just the most feared biker in America, he was the most wanted, literally. Number 453 on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, a position he earned by running the Outlaws Motorcycle Club's war against the Hells Angels with a systematic brutality that even rival outlaw clubs acknowledged. Bowman rose through the Outlaws to become international president by 1984. His tenure was defined by one thing above all: the Outlaws' organized campaign of violence against the Hells Angels. Not a rivalry, a documented, directed military campaign, bombings of Hells Angels clubhouses, ordered beatings and murders, coordinated operations across multiple states simultaneously. When his primary enforcer, Wayne "Joe Black" Hicks, was arrested in 1996 and flipped, providing federal investigators with detailed accounts of the bombings, the murders, and the chain of command that connected Bowman to all of it, the indictment that followed changed Bowman's life permanently. He was not home when the FBI came. He ran. Using the infrastructure of relationships 2 decades as international president had built connections to organized crime families in Chicago and Detroit who provided safe houses, networks, and cover. He stayed free for 15 months. The FBI placed him on the most wanted list with a $50,000 reward. He was caught on the 7th of June, 1999, in Sterling Heights, Michigan, while visiting his family. 40 federal agents were involved. He did not resist. His trial in Tampa in 2001 produced a conviction that the federal justice system, designed to be absolute, 2 life sentences plus 83 additional years. The 83 years was not symbolism. It was stacking each count representing a specific crime, each sentence running consecutively to ensure that no parole board, no legal change, no appellate ruling could ever produce his release. He was sent to the Butner Federal Correctional Complex in North Carolina. Even inside Butner, he remained what he had always been, not a former president, but the president. The man who had turned the outlaws into a genuine national force remained that man inside the walls. Harry Taco Bowman died of cancer on the 3rd of March 2019, at the age of 69, inside Butner, 19 years into a sentence that had no end. The end came only from disease. He sits at number 3 because what he built and how he ran it, the organizational sophistication of the Outlaws' campaign against the Hells Angels, the international infrastructure he constructed, represents something that only 1 or 2 men in the history of the outlaw motorcycle world surpassed. The specific organizational achievement that made Bowman number 3 on this list, and not simply another outlaw club president who went to prison, was the scale and sophistication of what he had built. The outlaws under his leadership were not a loosely affiliated collection of regional chapters sharing a name and a logo. They were an organized national operation with genuine international reach, coordinated decision-making at the top, and the specific capacity to direct violence across state lines simultaneously. The bombings of Hells Angels clubhouses that federal investigators documented were not local chapters acting independently on their own initiative. They were sanctioned, directed operations that originated at the top of the command structure that Bowman occupied. That organizational sophistication is what made the federal case against him so significant when it finally landed. The RICO statute was designed for exactly this kind of defendant, not a man who committed crimes himself, but a man who built and ran the enterprise through which others committed crimes on his direction. Bowman's legal liability rested on the same organizational structure that had made him powerful. Every member of the Outlaws who had bombed a Hells Angels clubhouse, or assaulted a rival, or carried out any of the specific criminal acts documented in the federal case, was acting as an extension of the authority that ran upward to Bowman's desk. That is what the federal government proved, and that proof produced a sentence designed to ensure that no mechanism in the legal system would ever produce his release. Number 2. Maurice Mom Boucher, the man who made the prison system afraid of him. Maurice Mom Boucher did something no other biker on this list did. He used prison guards as weapons, not against other inmates, against the institution itself. Boucher became a full-patch Hells Angel in 1987. By 1995, he had formed his own elite chapter, the Nomads, with one specific purpose: monopolizing the entire Quebec drug trade. Not a share of it, all of it. The Quebec biker war that followed the Hells Angels against the Rock Machine lasted 8 years, produced more than 160 deaths, and killed an 11-year-old boy in a car bomb that was aimed at someone else. Boucher absorbed every one of those consequences and kept pushing. In 1997, while under intense law enforcement pressure, Boucher ordered the murders of prison guards, not gang members, not rivals, prison guards. Diane Levine was shot and killed while driving home from work on the 26th of June, 1997. Pierre Rondeau was killed shortly afterward. A third survived an attack. The message was not subtle. No one who represented the justice system was safe. Not in court, not at work, not driving home. The response from Quebec law enforcement was not simply a criminal investigation, it was an institutional reckoning. The men and women who worked in the justice system, not just corrections officers, but prosecutors, investigators, and judges, understood what Boucher was communicating, that his organization would reach them in their private lives if they moved against him. He was arrested, tried. In 1998, astonishingly, acquitted. Quebec investigators later concluded the jury had been tampered with. An appeal led to a new trial. In 2002, he was convicted of first-degree murder for the deaths of both prison guards. Life sentence, no possibility of parole for at least 25 years. The corrections system sent him to a special handling unit, Canada's equivalent of Supermax. Even there, in 2010, he was stabbed in a prison dispute. The man who had once appeared untouchable was attacked inside the most secure facility Canada operated. He died of throat cancer on the 10th of July, 2022, inside a palliative care ward attached to a federal penitentiary. He had been incarcerated for 20 years. Julian Scher, the foremost expert on the Canadian biker world, said simply, "This is like Al Capone dying or John Gotti dying. Boucher was a kingpin. He was a man who ordered the murders of prison guards to scare the justice system. He died in prison, cared for by the same institution he had tried to terrorize. And he sits at number 2 because of what happened to the man ahead of him when they tried to put him in a cell. Keep watching. The number 1 spot goes to the man who changed how the entire system operated, not because of what he did inside the walls, because of who he remained. The specific audacity of what Boucher did to the justice system, ordering the murders of prison guards as a message to the people working to prosecute him, had an institutional impact that went beyond the criminal case. Eventually produced. The men and women who worked in the Quebec justice system understood what Boucher was communicating. He was not simply retaliating for specific actions against him. He was demonstrating, through the selection of targets who had done nothing to him personally and who simply worked for the institution, that his organization had the capacity and the willingness to reach anyone associated with the system that was trying to contain him. That demonstration changed how Quebec law enforcement operated. It produced enhanced security protocols for prosecutors. It produced increased protection for witnesses. It produced the specific institutional acknowledgement that the Hells Angels under Boucher were not a motorcycle club with criminal elements, but a criminal organization with a motorcycle club as its public face. The institutional changes that resulted from Boucher's campaign against prison guards cost the Quebec justice system money, resources, and the specific psychological toll that comes from working inside a system that has been directly threatened. He was eventually contained, sentenced, imprisoned, stabbed, expelled by his own club, and dead inside a palliative care ward. But the system that contained him was changed by the effort of doing so. That is the specific measure of his power and why he sits at number 2. Number 1. Sonny Barger, the man the prison system could not contain. Ralph "Sonny" Barger was never the most violent biker who went to federal prison. He was not the man with the most bodies. He did not serve the longest sentence. He did not make the most dramatic exit. He sat at the top of this list because of something more difficult to measure and more difficult to manage than any of those things. He walked into every institution that held him, and the institution reorganized itself around his presence, not the other way around. Barger went to prison more than once. His first serious stint began in 1973, when he was sent to Folsom State Prison on drug and weapons charges. Folsom was not a minimum security facility. It held the most dangerous men in California's criminal system. Barger walked in as the most famous Hells Angel in the world, the man who had built the organization from a handful of Oakland veterans into an international criminal institution and spent his time there doing exactly what he did on the outside, running the club. Even from inside Folsom, Barger continued to influence the Hells Angels. The club did not drift, it did not fracture. It continued operating because Barger was still there, still reachable, still the man whose judgment settled disputes and whose authority no one challenged. Not from behind bars, not from a cell. From wherever he was, it was still him. In 1988, he was convicted again, this time for conspiring to violate federal explosives, firearms, and arson laws in organized plots against the outlaws, specifically targeting their clubhouses. Attorney General Ed Meese stated publicly that Barger's arrest had prevented 5 murders. Barger was sentenced to 6 years at the Phoenix Federal Correctional Institution in Arizona. Inside Phoenix FCI, the institutional dynamic that had defined his time at Folsom repeated itself. He did not pick fights. He did not make declarations. He did not need to. Every person in the institution, every officer, every other inmate, every administrator, understood that the man in that cell was not simply an individual serving time. He was the leader of the Hells Angels, and the Hells Angels were still operating. The organizational structure that he headed did not recognize his incarceration as a change in command. There was no interim president. There was no power vacuum. There was just Barger, in a cell, still at the top. The throat cancer that removed his vocal cords in 1982 added a specific dimension to his presence inside the walls. He could not speak above a raspy whisper, a voice like gravel filtered through the hole in his throat. And somehow, Speaking with that damaged voice in a whisper, he communicated more authority than men shouting across a yard. The whisper made people lean in. Leaning in meant listening carefully. And listening carefully to Sonny Barger was the posture of a man who understood that the person speaking was worth taking seriously. He told an interviewer once that he had spent 12 or 13 years in prison total across all his stints. "Not much," he said, "considering all the fun I had." That specific attitude, the boredom, the dismissiveness, the absolute refusal to treat prison as anything more significant than a pause in ordinary life, was what made the people managing him most uncomfortable. You cannot rehabilitate a man who sees no problem with his choices. You cannot intimidate a man who considers prison a normal part of a well-rounded life. And you cannot neutralize a man whose authority is not located in his physical freedom, but in who he is and what he built. The Bureau of Prisons eventually developed the Communication Management Unit program, specifically to address the problem that Barger and men like him represented. CMUs restrict communication to one monitored phone call per week. They require all contact in English. They are designed to prevent an imprisoned leader from running his organization from inside a federal cell. The CMU program was built because of what Barger and others demonstrated, that organizational authority does not stop at the prison gate. What made Barger the most feared biker in US prison history was not any single act of violence. It was the specific and documented fact that he walked out of every institution that held him exactly the same man who had walked in. The prison system is designed to change people. Its entire justification, rehabilitation, deterrence, incapacitation, rests on the premise that time inside affects the person serving the time. Barger went in 13 years across multiple sentences. He came out the same man every time. He died on the 8th of June 2022 at the age of 83 at his home in Arizona. Not in a facility, not under institutional care. At home, the prison system had held him for 13 years across his lifetime and had not changed him in any way he considered worth mentioning. The institution that was supposed to be stronger than any one man met, in Ralph Sonny Barger, the man it could not contain, not because he escaped, not because he was too violent to manage, but because who he was existed entirely outside the reach of what a prison is designed to do. He was not the most violent biker to go to prison. He was not the biker with the longest sentence. He was the biker who, more than any other, made the American federal prison system realize that reputation, authority, and institutional power can walk through a gate in a way that bars and walls and armed officers are fundamentally not designed to stop. That is why Sonny Barger sits at number 1. 10 men, tens of thousands of combined years in sentences, and a single thread running through every case. The institution could hold the body, but not the reputation. Thomas Heath brought 4 decades of violence through the gate and never gave it up. George Wethern brought a death warrant that outlasted his cooperation deal by decades. Raymond Folks brought the disciplined brutality of a man who ran organized violence and financial fraud with the same focused efficiency. Christopher Ranieri brought the cold calculation of a man who flew across the country to celebrate a murder he ordered. Jeffrey Pike brought the institutional authority of a national president who directed an empire from the top of an organizational chart. Adam Lee Hall brought the specific danger of a man the FBI itself had assessed as too uncontrollable to manage. George Christie brought the organizational intelligence of the most sophisticated biker leader ever to go through the system. Harry Bowman brought the status of the most wanted biker in America and died before his first parole eligibility date. Maurice Boucher brought the audacity of a man who had ordered the murders of prison guards to scare the justice system itself. And Sonny Barger brought something none of them had in quite the same form: the absolute, undisturbed certainty that what he was did not change based on where he was. He went in as the man who built the Hells Angels. He came out the same man, every time. The institution tried. It did not win. Subscribe and hit the bell. There are more stories like this one coming. And the walls, as always, don't hold them the way anyone hopes they will.